Hi, everybody. We're back for our second lecture on deontology. So again, that's just a technical term for the moral theory that instead of just focusing on well-being and promoting well-being and thinking that equality is a matter of treating everyone's well-being as equally important, instead, deontology starts out from the idea that there are beings that have a certain moral status, which typically includes all human beings at least, and that they have certain basic moral rights. And being moral is a matter of respecting the rights of all these people. And so moral equality in this view is connected to the idea of equal moral rights. And often, as I mentioned, there's a set of correlative duties that you have towards beings with rights, which we'll see when we get to Kant can include maybe you might have duties to yourself. And often this theory, deontology, also uses the language of respect and respect for persons and their rights. And so that's what we'll be talking a little bit about in today's lecture. It's on responding to rights violations. And so I've got a picture of W.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. And then this is Bernard Boxall, who's a professor at UNC, in his book, Blacks and Social Justice. And so Boxall's interested in the question of how you should respond to right violations. And in particular, he's giving you a beat on this debate that took place between Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois during the Reconstruction era in the United States. And they wanted to know how do you respond to racism? And so that's the framework we'll be talking about today in the debate they had, but it could also apply to other cases where someone's being harassed in the workplace, for example. How should they respond to rights violations? And as we'll see when we get into Kant, deontologists often get worried about the hierarchical power structures in our societies and the way people can treat other people poorly in those situations. And there's a question of how you should respond to rights violations. So the general question in this reading is, should you protest against a rights violation, even if that won't promote aggregate well-being, so it won't promote your own well-being or the well-being of other people, or reduce the amount of injustice? So you can ask, if you're in a situation where you or someone you know is being mistreated and their rights are being disrespected, what should they do, right? One option would be to protest it. So you can make a distinction between three cases. One, they might remonstrate with a person. And so maybe you think the person who did wrong here is relatively reasonable. You could reach them and convert them, and they could come to admit their fault and change their ways. So that would be obviously a nice situation if you thought you could be in it. Now, you might think there's a stubborn wrongdoer and this person is not going to listen to reason or trying to talk some moral sense into them. But you might still protest, and I call this a case of a remedial protest, where you're hoping that your protest will lead to a remedy. So, maybe other people in the situation will do something about it. So if someone was mistreating someone at a workplace and you went and protested, and the protest reached the ears of someone higher up in the hierarchy or a human resource officer or something, maybe there'd be some remedy. And even if you couldn't get the person to admit fault and change, there might be some benefit to you or to other people who are suffering, or there might be an increase in justice. So that'd be a case for remedial protest. It leads to a remedy. Now, the case we're interested in is a case we can call powerless protest. So that's where you're confronted with a stubborn wrongdoer or a class of wrongdoers. And there's no hope that your protest against the wrongs will convert these people and get them to admit fault and change, or you're going to really get any kind of remedy or redress. So the question is, if it's not going to lead to a good consequence, how could it be morally right to do? So you could see, if you remember, in consequentialism, it was built into their framework to say right actions have to be ones that bring about, we should look at the consequences. So the question here is, could it be right to protest a wrong, knowing it's not going to lead to any positive outcome in terms of benefit or reduced injustice? And so Booker T. Washington thought powerless protest was morally bad. So he in fact said, no, you should not engage in this. And he gave two reasons, really. One was, if you're a powerless person who's being mistreated unjustly, someone's trampling on your rights, if you protest and you can't get anything out of it, it betrays a kind of weakness that you're relying on sympathy or pity. So sort of like you're trying to get people to feel sympathetic or bad for you. And he thinks that shows a lack of self-respect. So he counseled a more stoic attitude in the face of unrepentant injustice that you could not convert. You couldn't find a remedy for. And the other thing he thought is that powerless protest ignores the fact that actually these people who are unjust and are mistreating you, it's worse for them to be unjust than it is for you to be treated unjustly. And so his idea here is an idea that Boxall mentions. It's in Greek philosophy. You actually find it in also Eastern philosophy. You find it in the Christian tradition, various religious traditions. The idea is, it's if you're a morally bad person, that's actually worse than having someone mistreat you, because they're corrupted, right? If they're an unjust, immoral person. So those were Washington's reasons for thinking that powerless protest in this case wasn't really a good plan. In fact, it was a bad plan, morally bad idea. So here's what Boxall says. And so he does first in the article is he responds to these points of Washington. And then he talks about, could he give a positive argument that you should actually protest in that case? So what he says to Washington, Washington's first point was powerless protest betrays weakness, relying, you're trying to get sympathy or pity. And so here's what Boxall says. Well, look, okay, that could be true, unless if the protest is a demand for rights to be respected. So there are cases where people protest and they're doing that in order to get sympathy and to get people to feel sorry for them. He thinks that would actually not be good. But he says sometimes protest isn't that. Protest is a demand for your rights to be respected. So he says protest could be self-indulgent if it were a demand for help. It could show a kind of lack of self-reliance if it claimed, we're powerless, we need help, can you give us a handout, right? He thinks that's probably what Washington was worried about. But he says if you're insisting on your rights, the protester, you can demand help. And you're not asking for a handout. You're not asking for help, or you're not claiming you're powerless. What you're doing is you're saying, I have these rights and you have to respect them. So he thinks in that case, you're not appealing for sympathy. You're instead demanding respect. And he says, look, usually in this case, you're demanding non-interference. So he says what Frederick Douglass protested against, for example, was interference. So he didn't want help that's supererogatory. So that's a term we talked about a long time ago. It means things that are above and beyond the call of duty. So the point here is the protester is not going to be doing anything bad if what they're doing is demanding something that they have a right to. They're not asking for something above and beyond the call of duty from others. They're saying, you need to do what you have a duty to do, which is respect my rights. I'm not asking for some handout that's a really nice thing for you to do on top of that. This is something you have to do, and it's your duty to do. So that's how he responds to the first objection. Okay, and the second argument that Washington had was that powerless protest ignores that it's worse to be unjust than to be treated unjustly. And so Boxall says, well, that might actually be true. It's a morally worse condition to be in to be unjust than to be treated unjustly. So it's worse to be a morally bad person. Like that's worse for you than to have someone mistreating you. Like if you're a morally bad person, it's really bad for you. So you could think about whether you think that's true based on the theories of well-being we talked about. But you might grant that. He's sort of granting that for the sake of argument. He says, look, but we have to combat rights violations more strenuously than other moral defects. So you might think it's really bad for people to be immoral. That's a really bad situation, morally speaking. But now it's not our duty to go around. We don't have some really strong pressure to go around and try to make everyone maximally moral. But we do have strong pressure to go around and stop rights violations. So he thinks that's the issue, is that you have to separate which is a morally worse situation to be in from which situation is one that it's incumbent upon us to stand up and complain about. He thinks, well, we have to stand up and complain about are rights violations, not just people falling into bad moral situations. There might be people who are living morally horrible lives and not harming anyone else, and you don't need to protest that the same way you need to protest a rights violation. So he says, being treated unjustly involves a rights violation, and so that's why we need to protest it. So, and then he brings in the idea of self-respect, and he says basically self-respect involves a negative judgment and perhaps a feeling of indignance about your rights violations. So he thinks if you're self-respecting and someone's mistreating you, if you have self-respect, you're going to be angry and feel indignant, and you're going to recognize your rights are being violated, and you're going to know that's wrong. Okay, So he thinks that they'll have that. But then the question really here is, should this be expressed, this feeling of self-respect and indignation at being mistreated, should it be expressed, for example, in powerless protest? Washington gave those reasons he thought that shouldn't be expressed. Boxall has shot those down. So what he's going to move to next is he says, look, if Washington's defenders aver protest often provokes prosecution, why should the weak and vulnerable people protest? What good could it do? So imagine that scenario. If you protest, not only will it not benefit you, not only will it not improve justice, those people, the people who are bad are going to get mad and they're just going to do more bad stuff to you. So it's going to provoke retaliation. Why would you do that? That's what he says. That's what so Washington's people are going to push. And so, but then he says, look, people do actually protest in that case. So he mentions Du Bois exhorted Black people, even when bending to the inevitable, bend with unabated protest. And so you got this kind of contradiction here of like two different pieces of advice, right? And what he wants to know is this just bravado, or does a person with self-respect have a reason to protest over and above the hope it will bring relief? So if they know it won't bring relief, it's not going to might bring more harm on them, right? As a form of kind of retaliation. Why would a person do this? So that's the puzzle he wants to set up at this point. He's argued Washington's criticisms don't hold water, but why positively do this? The alternative, he says, is you could pretend to be servile. So someone who's servile is someone who sort of goes along with what the people who think that they are self-important and they have a right to better treatment do. So there are people out there that say, maybe we're in a special group, we don't have to respect your rights. We can trample all over you and do whatever we want to our advantage. A servile person goes along as someone who believes that that's actually okay and goes along with the mistreatment. Now, someone who pretends to be servile is someone who you go along with someone's false appearance that they deserve special treatment. You don't protest their mistreatment of you. You might actually think that it's wrong, but you don't stick up for yourself, right? You sort of go along and you don't complain, keep your head down, and just suck it up and try to stoically deal with the mistreatment. And so that's the question is, if it would help, why wouldn't a self-respected person pretend to be servile? So they might be like, look, I actually know I have my rights. This person shouldn't be doing what they're doing. I'm pissed about it. I'm indignant, but I'm going to swallow my pride and just in order to avoid further bad stuff happening to me and maybe get ahead or whatever it is, I'll just eat it and I'll just keep going. And I know these people are wrong, but I'm not going to like make it into an issue. That would be the notion of pretend servility. And so Boxall says you could try to argue, no, you shouldn't give in for pretend servility. You should protest in these cases. And he discusses some ways he might try to argue for that he doesn't think work. So first, you might say, well, you should protest to make other people recognize you have the rights. So if someone's mistreating you, you know you have your rights. You know what they're doing is wrong. But protesting looks like it won't lead to any good. Why? So you might say, well, you should protest to get those other people to recognize that you have the rights. And so he says, look, well, self-respect is a good quality, right? But you don't have to be a saint. Why should you do that to try to make them better people? Like they're the one mistreating you. So why should you be protesting to try to hopefully get them to understand it? You know, we think we're in a powerless protest case, probably they're not going to understand it anyway. But even if they would, they're a jerk. Why do you need to try to improve them morally and get them to understand the moral facts? The second thing you could say is a self-respecting victim of justice should protest to make others recognize and reassure him he has rights. Maybe you're hoping other people in the situation, even if they can't get rid of the injustice, you know, your allies or the people who are good will tell you, yes, you're right. Those people are wrong. And then that'll reassure you, yes, you really do have these rights. And so he thinks, well, okay, that kind of shows a kind of lack of self-reliance. The self-respecting person shouldn't need to depend on other people's feedback. You should, you know, you've got your rights. You don't need other people to tell you that. You should just stick up for yourself. But if you shouldn't be sticking up for yourself and protesting in order to get other people to support you and tell you you have these rights. So he thinks that's sort of not a good thing. And then the last thing he thinks someone could say is, well, the protest might be designed to compel acknowledgement that you're a moral being. Or that just means you're being capable of being responsible and acting freely. You're not like other animals. You're a moral being. You're a human who can do things to be responsible. And he thinks, look, that's not really that reasonable because someone who's a master of a slave or someone who's like a really domineering, horrible boss who's mistreating people in ways that violates their rights, that person can say, oh, I know you're a moral being who's capable of being responsible in some minimal sense. They just think, I don't care. I don't think you have any rights. I can just do whatever I want, or I don't care about your rights. I'm going to ignore them. And I think that's justified or something. So basically, none of these arguments does Boxall think will give you a positive argument for protesting. So what I want to do now is pause with the think sheet and say, think about there's process roles all across our societies. Really bad cases involve masters with slaves, but there are other ones. And think about some boss who's very domineering and is mistreating and abusing people in the workplace. And so here's two things you can do. You could pretend to be servile to the boss in order to get him to not do more bad stuff to you, maybe to get ahead a little bit, right? Or you could protest against the boss, knowing that that's likely not to get you more benefits, not to get you an increased treatment, better treatment. And in fact, maybe you're going to pay a price. So which one of those do you think is right to do? So check out the think sheet. I've got a question for you, how you'd advise a friend in this situation. And then we'll come back for the second part of the lecture. I'll talk about Boxall's, his own positive argument. Okay, so you've made your decision what you would tell your friend in that situation, what you think the morally right thing to do would be, and then what also you think, all things considered, would tell the person to do. So we're going to move on. Now, Boxall's going to give you, the last part I want to go over, Boxall does then have an argument that he thinks works that says you should protest in this case, and would say your friend should protest in the case we talked about there. So the one option is you could pretend to be servile, right? So you sort of go along with the boss is saying, and so he says, first, think about why is that an appealing option, or like a strategically good option often in these situations? Well, he thinks, look, besides injuring people that's not commensurate with their worth and rights, so people like a dictatorial boss or the slave master, they're harming the people and they're violating their rights, right? Well, in addition to that, the uncontested and unopposed injustices invites witnesses to believe that the victim is somehow wicked or inferior and deserves it. So he thinks that's a general thing. When people are just unopposed and no one's protesting or complaining, there's a general kind of sense of people in the environment could start to think, oh, well, that person, yeah, they had it coming, or no big deal. Sort of start to believe they don't really have the rights. Maybe they were wicked or inferior, don't deserve any better. And then he thinks, look, oppressors no doubt desire to be justified. So they want to believe more than that their treatment of others is fitting. They want those they mistreat to condone their mistreatment as proper and offer inducements and rewards to that end. So that's why they want the servility. They want you to act in a way like you have this, like they're not doing anything wrong. And in fact, maybe their behavior is justified or good. And you might want to think back to Besser, right? And so Testament. So that's part of the idea, is that in being beings that have this desire for kind of social relatedness, Testament took that in a direction and said, wrongdoers often do well. And the reason she gave was they often surround themselves by a social milieu that tells them what they're doing is not morally bad, or maybe it's morally good, or it's certainly justified, right? That's how they kind of can be happy, she thinks, despite not being morally good. They have this illusion that they're morally okay or good. And so here Boxall is pointing out this is often a kind of motive behind people who violate people's rights and mistreat people. They want this, they give incentives for the victims themselves to act or play along with that illusion or enable that illusion. So self-respecting persons may be tempted at least to pretend civility for relief from the mistreatment, right? So if you sort of go along with the boss's bad behavior, or someone who's telling jokes that are immoral, various other things, if you go along with bad behavior, you might get some benefits and you might not suffer as much harm. So there could be a temptation to go along with it. And so, but then Boxall thinks there's a real risk with this. Okay, if you're the person who's the victim of injustice and you start going along, you don't protest, right? This pretense has its dangers. It can shake your confidence in your own self-respect. So he argues that the self-respecting person in such straits must in some way protest in order to assure himself that he has self-respect. So that's the basic idea Boxall has, is that if you have self-respect, but you start going along with this and you don't protest, that's going to shake your confidence that you actually do respect yourself. So that's what he thinks is the core of the issue here. And so he says that there's a kind of need to know you have self-respect that's built into self-respect itself. So first of all, he points out, if you're a person of self-respect, right, you stand up for you know you have rights. You know that if you know people desert you, someone's trampling on your rights or mistreating you, and you feel indignant about that. Okay, but you know people with self-respect lose it. There's some people who stop really believing they have these rights and really in their own mind recognizing this and feeling angry when they're mistreated. Some people start to go along with this. And he thinks a person with self-respect may not know whether you still have it now or whether you'll have it in the future, especially if you're kind of going along with people mistreating you. Do you really respect yourself or not? It's gonna be unclear when you start to go along with mistreatment, he thinks. So he says if a person has self-respect, he'll care about having it and retaining it. And you can't be satisfied that you have something unless you know you have it. So he says the self-respecting person is going to want to know that he's self-respecting. And in this kind of, he needs evidence. Like anything else, you need evidence that you're self-respecting. You don't just somehow magically know. And so he thinks the need for evidence is going to go up when others are violating your rights and people are inviting you to pretend that they aren't violating your rights and what they're doing is justified. So there's a sort of pressure in the situation on you to come up with more evidence to really be able to say honestly with yourself that you know you are self-respecting. And so what he thinks is that to provide that evidence that you have self-respect, you need to protest. So the reason you need to protest is you need to provide yourself with a firm basis for knowing you actually do respect yourself. And that if you go along with this instead, you're going to lack evidence that you really respect yourself. And then that's going to start to shake your confidence. And so your self-respect demands you do things in order to have more evidence again and have this knowledge. And the thing you need to do is protest. So that's Boxall's argument. And he thinks, so he says, because you want to know yourself as self-respecting, if you're in a powerless situation, a self-respected person must be driven to make others take him seriously. So if he's endured wrongs, he can't repeal, right? He can't get rid of the injustice. He can't benefit himself. But he feels his self-respect threatened by the treatment. So he has to publicly claim that wrongs have been done to him in order to reassure himself that he has self-respect. So his protest tells everyone that he believes he has rights and that he therefore claims self-respect. So that's his positive idea. And so you want to think about is, what do you think about that argument applied to the case from the think sheet? Does it change your mind at all? Does it do you think it's a good argument for why your friend should stand up for themselves? Do you see this worry? Do you buy into this worry he has that if you don't stand up for yourself, you're not going to have evidence that you actually have self-respect? And you might start to doubt, maybe I don't really have self-respect, and maybe I'm disrespecting myself and going along with this. So that's the question. He thinks if you start going along with this treatment and sort of pretending you think it's okay and enabling the boss to go on and maybe his cronies to go along with this illusion that he's justified, at that point, you have to start wonder, well, wait a minute, am I disrespecting myself here, or do I have self-respect, but I'm just pretending? And so he thinks, okay, it won't be clear. And that's why you need to protest in order to have this knowledge that you really do have self-respect here, and you know that. And so then the last thing you want to think about is, as we go forward, is we're going to start learning about other duties you have and other rights. And we're going to want to be thinking generally about, does this argument generalize that you need to protest all types of rights violations or all types of cases where people fail to do what they have a duty to do to you or not? But we're going to more generally be moving on in the next reading to what are different rights that people might posit, or what their different duties. And you'll be reading an article by a philosopher who will lay out a general theory of duties. And what he's going to be doing is explicitly criticizing consequentialism and arguing deontological theory that's based on duties is superior and gives a better account of what's right and why it's right, and what's wrong and why it's wrong. And so that's what we're going to be doing the next reading. And then we'll be moving into a discussion of abortion and how thinking in terms of rights would guide you to think about the morality of abortion. And we'll be talking about both sides of that as we move into that part of the unit. So that's it for today. And I will see you all on next Monday.